Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Hello, this is Jeffrey W. Ingram, and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of the World Builder's Anvil. And today's topic is, what is world building? Now, you might think for a second, what is so important about what is world building when the show is about world building? And the reason I want to talk about this is it's important to understand what I mean when I talk about world building, or else it might lead to some confusion. First off, I don't mean a world. A world is unimportant necessarily for a story. It could be a part of a world, or it could be a universe with multiple worlds in it. It's really a setting for which stories can take place. For me, it happens to be a world, and potentially other worlds if I get further into science fiction. However, for you, it could be something else. It could be a town, it could be a building, it could be a solar system, or a whole universe. So there are a few topics I would like to talk about. The rules of the universe, the places in a universe, the races, the faces, and by faces I mean the people, and time. The reasons I look at all these things when I world build is I'm trying to create a natural setting, something that the person who hears my story won't be caught up in the details. They won't get hurt. By hurt, I really mean they lose interest in the story because they don't understand the setting. And that is a danger whenever you do fantasy or science fiction. It's so out there. It's so out of the realm of the person's thought. Your audience either gets too small or goes to almost none because people just don't find it interesting. And the other thing I like to think about with world building is creating a framework, kind of like the gears in a clock. The world happens. Stories are inside of the world all over. It's merely picking a place and a time. And once I have a place and a time, the stories just happen, whether they're romance or they're mysteries or they're thrillers. However the story wants to be delivered can exist. It's picking the correct part of the world that you want to tell it in, the part you want to share. Now, rules are easy. Rules are essentially the place that you define the limits of your universe. How is it different from our universe? How is it the same as our universe? Are there new elements like magic that don't exist in our universe? Or are certain rules that do exist in our universe, like, say, relativity, don't take place in this universe? The next is places. Places I love. And I break it down into two major areas, cosmology and geography. Cosmology is the way the universe physically looks around your setting. It is, how many moons does your planet have? Is there a sun? What color is the sun? How many planets can be seen from your world? I mean, planets have a huge effect, and stars and moon motions on cultures, especially early on. They warn them of things that are coming, of season changing. They give them things to wonder about, things to make them start wondering about their place in the universe. Cosmology is a great way to start when you're thinking about a new culture. And the other is geography. If you kind of look at cultures that exist on Earth, a lot of times geography has a huge impact on them. Usually, if a culture lives in a very tough place to survive, their gods are very, very strict. You're much more likely to see human sacrifice and to see it more often. So geography has a huge importance on the development of cultures, probably more so than cosmology. However, I believe they both play a fundamental role in it. Then there's physical geography. Is it mountains? Is it plains? Is it ocean? These all, once again, have impacts too, not just the severity of them, but whether or not they exist. Are they close? Are they far away? Do they even know about them? And of course, my favorite is cultures. What causes cultures to come up with certain beliefs and to disregard other beliefs? What happens when two cultures clash together in a world at a certain time? Does one culture come to dominate the other culture? Does the two cultures blend together? What impact would happen if there weren't Germans in the forest north of Rome? What would have changed in the development of the Roman Empire? Would it have been positive or negative? It's all about what if questions when it comes to cultures and trying to make good choices that people will find believable. Then races. This is very big in fantasy and sci-fi races, whether they're aliens from another planet, whether they are different races, like your classic elves, dwarfs, orcs, goblins that you see often throughout fantasy, whether they're extremely different, whether they are similar to human. Races are a massively important concept. And then, of course, faces, the people. People will typically be assigned to a certain cultural group. However, they'll never exactly fit into that group. For example, let's say Jeff Ingram, I'm an American. And to be an American, there's a certain class of ideals that I should probably have to fit into society. But much like any other American, I don't exactly fit into any of those categories. There might be some that I'm very close to society with, and there are others that I'm very far from society with. And each NPC is the same way. You have to look at them in the scope of the culture and say, hey, even though this person happens to be an American, he's not a good American, to put it into context of some political people, or he's a great American because he believes what I believe. These are all very important questions. And then, of course, you have some important things like, what are my personal motivations? They're going to be different than my wife's, who's in the same house. She's also an American. She also fits into the spectrum of how good of an American or bad of an American she is. Probably not in the same place. However, since we're married, I'm sure there has to be some kind of crossover, but that's not always necessarily true either. And the most important thing, I believe, when you're looking at world building is the effects of these things over time. If you take a snapshot of an economy or a culture today, like, what is the American economy today? It will not be in the same place in 10 years. Will it be bigger? Will it be smaller? How do you get from bigger to smaller? It's not always very easy to know these things. I think it does take a little bit of study. However, I think ultimately you have to make the choices that you think will fit with your target audience, the people who you want to interact with your stories when they're done. Now, I'm not a big believer in preaching philosophy to my story readers or people who I play games with. However, there might be certain conclusions I assume they're going to draw from the events that take place. However, it might occur to them in a completely different way. One of the interesting things I can remember is the Hunger Games, and you would have libertarians and progressives, people on the right and left wing of American politics, both claiming that this book, held the ideals that they believed in. And a lot of times it's people just trying to take a story they like and fit it in to their belief system. However, personally, I don't really know what the author had in mind, and I don't really care. I just enjoyed the story. However, I did draw my own conclusions as well. But ultimately, it's unimportant because the kinds of discussions about her dystopian world that happened drove the thought beyond just the story, and it allowed the story to codify in my mind. And I could remember her story better because of its interaction with my belief system. However, some stories I think don't do very well at this. A classic one being like Ayn Rand. Like her or hate her, the preachy characters that are always extremes in philosophy aren't necessarily appealing to people. So people who like it can accept it, and then people who dislike it won't listen to it because it's really just sort of political preaching. And if you want to do that, that's a choice you got to make in your stories. However, I do warn that when you have people talking in your stories, it has a huge impact on the way the world works. But remember, it's not static. So you kind of need a basic understanding of how cultures get to where they are, who they interacted with along the way, what did they absorb, what did they learn from each other as they got there. And the characters, the same thing too. unless they were born yesterday, in which case they'll probably be a pretty boring character because they're just gaga googling all the time. You have to take that in stride and sit there and go, things change over time. Either they reinforce existing beliefs or they change beliefs. However, what is the impact of at least the major events of a culture or a character or even a geography over time? If you have a giant meteor crash into your world, what happens? Does it kill off a bunch of races? Do they struggle to survive? Time is the forgotten but most important element of world building. It is time for the rating. This is a basic topic. You really need to understand it, why you're world building and what world building is. If you don't understand those topics, you're going to have a scattered world that's built. And unless you're just world building for the sake of learning more about the way the world is, that's not going to be very beneficial to you. The world building task for today is to go find any notes that you've ever made for your world. Scribble down pieces of paper. Maybe there are some maps on graph paper. Maybe there's some characters that you know that exist. Go take those, bring them together, and start breaking them down. Is it a place? Is it a race? Is it a person? Is it a history? Is it a rule for my universe? Start breaking them down into those kind of piles, because as the show goes on, we're going to address things under those examples. And now, the real world task for the day. This is a simple one that I forget often. Just check the trash can when you're going outside, folks. Pull it up, take it out. If you have a spouse, they'll be happy that the trash has been taken out. And if you live by yourself, you got to remember to do it. So if it's getting full, just take it outside. It'll make everyone's life easier. If your life is easier, the people you live with, if their life is easier, then you're going to have a little bit more time to be able to world build throughout the week. So have a great week. And thank you very much for listening to my first episode of the World Builders Anvil. Next time on the World Builders Anvil, we'll be talking about why are you building a fantasy world? And I say fantasy in the context of actual genre fantasy, but it could be fantastical in any way. Why are you building a world in the first place? That's another important topic that we're going to have to cover before we can get into the nuts and bolts of world building. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Garduel.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.